Her father signed away her future in front of a crowd, but the quiet cowboy who received her never asked what was wrong with her. He only asked what she could become. The papers trembled in Clara Whitfield's hands as her father's signature dried beneath the Colorado sun. Ranch workers stood silent while the wind snapped against the wooden gate, and the woman he called a burden was sent away with a single trunk. But when she reached the lonely Wyoming ranch, the cowboy waiting there did something nobody expected. Stay with us to discover why. Subscribe for more unforgettable stories. The morning sun rose over the dry hills outside Denver, Colorado, casting a pale gold light across the Whitfield ranch. The estate had once been a place Clara Whitfield loved. As a child, she had run between the barns, climbed the wooden fences, and followed the ranch hands as they checked the cattle. Back then, she believed the wide fields belonged to everyone who worked them. But over the years, the ranch became something different. It became a place where every room had rules, every conversation had expectations, and every mistake seemed to carry her father's disappointment. At 27 years old, Clara knew every corner of the main house. She knew the creak in the third-floor hallway. She knew which window rattled when the wind came down from the foothills. She knew how Edward Whitfield liked his morning coffee prepared. 2 spoonfuls of sugar, never cream. She knew many things, but she had never learned how to make her father proud. That morning, she stood outside her father's office with both hands folded in front of her. The polished wooden door was open just enough for voices to escape. Edward Whitfield sat behind his large oak desk, surrounded by papers, account books, and letters from cattle buyers across the territory. His gray hair was perfectly combed. His vest was buttoned neatly. Nothing about him suggested that the conversation happening inside was about to change his daughter's life. Across from him sat Caleb Dawson. Caleb was a successful cattle buyer from Wyoming, a man with expensive boots, a clean coat, and a smile that appeared whenever someone important was watching. Clara had known for months what her father wanted: a marriage. Not because he believed Caleb was kind, not because he thought Clara would be happy, because Caleb Dawson had money, influence, and connections that would strengthen the Whitfield name. Clara pushed the office door open. "Father." Both men looked up. Edward's expression hardened slightly. "You should have waited until you were invited." Clara stepped inside anyway. "I believe this concerns me." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her the way a man might examine a horse before buying it. Clara noticed. She always noticed. She wore a simple blue dress that morning, one she had chosen because it allowed her to breathe comfortably while working around the ranch. It was not the kind of dress society ladies in Denver would have worn to impress guests. Edward looked at her clothing first, then at her. That small movement told her everything. "You have embarrassed this family enough," he said. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Clara remained standing. "I refused a marriage proposal. That is not a crime." Edward's jaw tightened. It was not merely a proposal, it was an opportunity. "For you," Clara answered. Silence filled the office. Caleb looked away for a moment, pretending not to enjoy the tension. Edward slowly stood. "For years I have defended you. I have ignored the whispers. I have made excuses." Clara felt her fingers tighten together. "I never asked you to make excuses for me." "That is exactly the problem," Edward said. "You do not understand what your position requires." Her father walked around the desk and stopped near the window overlooking the ranch. Outside, men were moving cattle through the southern pasture. Horses walked along the fence line. The ranch continued its ordinary morning while Clara's world narrowed inside that room. "You were given every advantage," Edward continued. "A good education, a respected family name, a comfortable life." Clara looked at him. "And all of that disappears because I will not marry a man I do not love." Caleb's smile faded. Edward turned back. "Love," he said the word like it was something childish. "Love does not keep a family business alive. Reputation does." Clara had heard that sentence in different forms her entire life. Reputation, appearance, expectations. Everything mattered more than what she felt. "I will not marry someone just because it improves your accounts," she said. For the first time, anger crossed Edward's face. "Then perhaps you need to learn what happens when you refuse the life provided for you." The office door opened behind them. Two ranch managers stepped inside carrying papers. Clara looked from them to her father. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. "What is this?" Edward returned to his desk. "A lesson." He picked up one of the documents. "You will be leaving tomorrow." Clara stared at him. "Leaving where? Wyoming territory?" The room seemed suddenly too quiet. Caleb watched her carefully. Edward continued. "Is the ranch owner named Thomas Reed. He has an outstanding debt connected to a cattle agreement we made 2 years ago. Instead of collecting payment, I have arranged another solution." Clara felt her chest tighten. "No." Edward ignored the word. "You will go to Reed Valley Ranch and work there. You cannot be serious." "I am very serious." Clara looked at Caleb. He did not meet her eyes. That hurt more than she expected. She had never liked him, but some small part of her hoped he would at least understand the cruelty of this. Instead, he simply adjusted his cufflinks. Edward placed the document on the desk. "This arrangement will remind you that life is not built around your feelings." Clara stepped closer. "You are sending me away because I refuse to marry him?" "I am sending you away because you have forgotten gratitude." Her face grew warm, not from embarrassment, from anger. All her life she had tried to be patient. She had tried to be useful. She had helped with ranch accounts when the bookkeeper was sick. She had studied medicine from old journals because she wanted to help injured workers and sick animals. But none of that mattered. Not to her father. A knock came at the office door. A ranch hand entered and removed his hat. "Mr. Whitfield, the men are asking if the meeting is still happening." Edward glanced at Clara. "Let them know it is." Minutes later, the decision was made public. The ranch workers gathered near the main house. Business partners stood nearby. The wind moved through the dry grass as Clara stood beside her father, feeling every eye turn toward her. Edward held the agreement. "My daughter will be leaving for Wyoming tomorrow." Whispers moved through the crowd. Clara kept her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Edward continued. "This is the consequence of refusing the responsibilities given to her." A few men looked uncomfortable, others looked away. No one stepped forward. That silence hurt more than the words. Edward signed the paper first, then he handed Clara the pen. For a moment, she simply stared at it. The old Clara might have cried. She might have begged. She might have asked him why. But standing there beneath the Colorado sun, she finally understood something. Her father had already answered that question. She took the pen. Her hand shook slightly. Not because she agreed, because she was writing the final line of the life she thought she had. When the ink dried, Edward took the document back without looking at her. "Your trunk will be packed by evening," that was all. No goodbye, no apology, no hesitation. Later that afternoon, Clara stood alone in her bedroom. The room was filled with things she had collected over the years. Books, letters, a small music box from her mother, a framed photograph of herself as a child standing beside Edward near the old barn. She picked up the photograph. For a long moment she held it. Then she placed it face down. She packed only what she needed. A few dresses, a coat, her notebooks, a small medical kit. Nothing that would remind her she had once belonged there. The next morning, the wagon waited outside. The sky was gray, and the air carried the smell of approaching rain. Edward stood near the steps. Clara carried her small trunk herself. He watched her approach, but said nothing. Father, he looked at her. For one brief moment, she hoped he might say something different. Something a father should say. Be careful, I am sorry. Come home when you are ready. Instead, he only said, do not embarrass this family again. Clara looked at him, then she climbed into the wagon. As the wheels rolled away from the Whitfield ranch, she did not look back, not because she did not care, because looking back would have meant admitting she was still waiting for someone to choose her. The road stretched north toward Wyoming, toward mountains she had never seen, toward a ranch owned by a man she had never met, a man her father believed was the perfect place to send away a daughter he no longer wanted to understand. Clara did not know what waited for her at Reed Valley Ranch. She only knew one thing. For the first time in her life, she was leaving a place where she had never truly belonged. The road north from Colorado felt longer than Clara Whitfield had imagined. The wagon moved slowly across open country, its wooden wheels groaning over uneven ground. The familiar fields of her father's ranch disappeared behind her, replaced by endless stretches of prairie, dry hills, and distant mountains rising like dark shadows against the sky. Clara sat beneath a wool blanket, her small trunk secured behind her with a rope. The morning air was cold enough that she could see her breath, and the driver beside her kept his coat pulled tight around his shoulders. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say. The driver had been paid to deliver her to Wyoming, not to comfort her, not to ask questions. And Clara had learned long ago that people rarely wanted the answers when they asked questions about her life. They only wanted the version that made them comfortable. During the first night on the road, they stopped at a small roadside inn near the foothills. Clara ate quietly at a wooden table near the window, while the other travelers talked about cattle prices, winter storms, and the growing towns farther west. She noticed the way people looked at her. Some looked curious, some looked away too quickly. She had spent years learning to recognize those small moments. A glance, a pause, a judgment made before a word was spoken. Clara lowered her eyes to the coffee cup between her hands. She was tired of being noticed before she was known. 3 days later, the landscape changed. The roads narrowed. The trees became taller. The mountains of Wyoming rose ahead of her, covered in dark pine and patches of snow that remained even as the season moved toward spring. The driver pointed toward a distant valley. Reed Valley is through there. Clara followed his gaze. The ranch was nowhere near a town. No elegant houses, no crowded streets, no neighbors nearby, only land. A wide valley surrounded by mountains, with fences stretching across the grasslands, and a wooden ranch house sitting alone against the wilderness. For a moment, Clara wondered if her father had chosen this place because it was far enough away that no one would hear her. The wagon passed through a large wooden gate marked with a simple sign. Reed Valley Ranch. A man stepped out from beside the barn. Clara knew immediately who he was, Thomas Reed. He was taller than she expected, not dressed like the wealthy men she had known in Denver. His coat was worn from years of work. His boots carried dust from the fields. His hands were rough, the kind of hands that belonged to someone who built things instead of simply owning them. He stood still as the wagon stopped, not staring, not judging, just watching. Clara tightened her grip on the edge of her coat. She prepared herself. She had been prepared for this moment since leaving home. Another man, another place, another person deciding what she was worth. The driver climbed down and handed Thomas a folded paper. Delivery from Edward Whitfield. Thomas took the document. His eyes moved over the page briefly, then he folded it again. Clara watched his face carefully. She expected a reaction, surprise, disappointment, perhaps even amusement. But there was nothing, only calm. The driver looked between them. Miss Whitfield, your trunk. Thomas stepped forward before Clara could lift it herself. I'll take that. His voice was lower than she expected. Not cold, not warm, simply steady. I can carry it. Thomas paused. His hand remained on the trunk handle. I believe you can. That answer caught her off guard. Most men would have either insisted she could not, or pretended she needed saving. Thomas did neither. After a moment, Clara released the handle. He carried the trunk toward the house. The ranch was quieter than she expected. There were no servants waiting. No one gathered to see the daughter of Edward Whitfield arrive. Only a few ranch hands working near the barn. One man looked over, then another. Their eyes followed Clara for a moment before they returned to their work. Thomas noticed. He did not say anything, but he slowed his steps slightly, walking beside her instead of ahead. The main house was smaller than the Whitfield estate, but it was well kept. The wooden porch had been repaired recently. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the wall. Through the window, Clara could see a simple kitchen with iron cookware hanging near the stove. Thomas opened the door. You'll stay in the room at the end of the hallway. Clara stepped inside. The room was plain. A bed, a small table, a wash basin, a window overlooking the eastern pasture. There were no flowers, no decorations, but it was clean. A folded blanket rested on the bed. A fresh towel sat beside the basin. Clara looked at them. You prepared this? Thomas looked toward the window. It seemed necessary. That was all he said. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, because she did not understand him. Her father had spent years reminding her she was a burden. This man, who had never met her before, had prepared a room without asking what she had done wrong. Thomas walked toward the doorway. There's food in the kitchen. Clara turned. Mr. Reed. He stopped. She hesitated. She wanted to ask 100 questions. Why did you agree to this? What did my father tell you? Do you know what he said about me? Instead, she asked the simplest one. What am I supposed to do here? Thomas looked back at her. The sunlight from the window fell across his face. You'll decide that. Clara frowned slightly. My father said I was sent here to work. Thomas nodded. He said many things. The answer was quiet. Almost too quiet. But Clara heard it. Thomas had read the papers. He knew exactly why she was there, yet he had not repeated a single cruel word. I owe your father money, Thomas continued. That agreement is between him and me. Clara stood still. And what about me? Thomas looked at her. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then he said, You are not a debt. The words were simple, but they stayed with her. Thomas left the room, closing the door gently behind him. Clara remained there alone. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The silence was different from the silence at home. At Whitfield Ranch, silence always meant someone was disappointed. Here it was just silence. That evening, Clara walked into the kitchen. Thomas was sitting at the table with a ledger open in front of him. A tin coffee mug rested near his hand. A small oil lamp burned beside him, casting warm light across the room. He looked up. You hungry? Clara almost answered no out of habit, but then she remembered the long journey, the cold mornings, the empty feeling that had followed her since leaving home. Yes, she said quietly. Thomas stood and served her a plate. No grand gesture, no unnecessary kindness, just a meal. They ate mostly in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the trees around the ranch. Clara looked across the table at him. This was the man her father had chosen as punishment, a man she was supposed to fear. Yet he had not insulted her, had not asked why she was unwanted, had not looked at her as if she were something to tolerate. Thomas noticed her watching him. What? Clara quickly looked down. Nothing. He returned to his meal. But for the first time in a very long time, Clara did not feel the need to apologize for taking up space. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. Old habits. She dressed carefully and stepped outside. The ranch was already awake. Horses moved in the stable. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Men carried supplies across the yard. Thomas stood near the fence, checking the condition of a wagon wheel. He looked up when he saw her. "You don't have to work today." Clara folded her arms. "I didn't come here to sit in a room." Thomas studied her for a moment. Then he handed her a pair of gloves from the fence post. "Then start with something simple." She took them, no pity, no doubt. Just an opportunity. As Clara followed him toward the barn, she realized something strange. She still did not know if this place would become a home. She still did not know if Thomas Reed could be trusted. But for the first time in years, someone had given her the chance to prove who she was before deciding who she was not. And that was something she had almost forgotten existed. The first week at Reed Valley Ranch taught Clara Whitfield something she had never learned inside the comfortable walls of her father's home. The land did not care about names. It did not care that she had grown up in a wealthy family. It did not care that she had once attended dinners with businessmen and their wives in Denver. The ranch only asked one thing. Could she endure? Every morning before sunrise, Clara heard the same sounds: the stable doors opening, the horses moving against the wooden stalls, the low voices of ranch hands preparing for the day. At first, she stayed in the house longer than she wanted to admit. Not because she was lazy, because she was afraid, not of the work itself, of failing. She had spent years being told that she was incapable, that she was too soft, too sheltered, too much trouble. Those words followed her even when no one was speaking. On the 8th morning, Clara walked into the kitchen before Thomas had finished his coffee. He looked up from his tin mug. "You're early." Clara tied her hair back with a simple ribbon. "I noticed everyone else has been awake for an hour." Thomas glanced toward the window. The sun had barely reached the mountain peaks. "That doesn't mean you need to match them. I'm here to work." Thomas studied her face for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." He did not argue. He did not tell her she could not. He simply handed her a pair of worn leather gloves. "Come with me." Outside, the morning air was sharp and clean. Frost still clung to the grass in the shaded parts of the pasture. The ranch stretched wide beneath the mountains, the fences cutting through the open land like long, dark lines. Tom led her toward the barn. "There are a few things you can learn first." He showed her how to check the horses before riding, how to look for a loose shoe, how to notice when an animal was acting differently, small things. Things that seemed obvious to him because he had spent years doing them. To Clara, they were new. She listened carefully. She asked questions. Thomas noticed that many people asked questions because they wanted attention. Clara asked because she wanted to understand. By the end of the morning, her gloves were covered in dust. Her boots had mud along the edges, and she had a small tear near the sleeve of her dress where it caught against a fence post. She looked at the damage and sighed. Thomas noticed. First lesson. She looked at him. "What?" "Clothes can be repaired." His eyes moved toward the torn sleeve. Most things can. It was such a simple thing to say, but Clara remembered it. The next few days were harder. Carrying feed sacks left her shoulders aching. Walking across the uneven pasture left her feet sore. The cold Wyoming wind seemed determined to find every space between her coat and clothing. The ranch hands watched, especially one named Walter Briggs. Walter had worked at Reed Valley for several years and had never hidden his doubts. One afternoon, while Clara struggled to move a heavy bucket near the barn, he exchanged a glance with another ranch hand. "She won't last the month," Walter muttered. He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. Clara heard. She always heard. Her hands tightened around the bucket handle. For a moment, she wanted to walk away. She wanted to prove him right, just so she would not have to keep proving herself wrong. Then Thomas stepped out of the barn. He looked at Walter, not angrily, just long enough. Walter lowered his eyes and returned to his work. Thomas turned towards Clara. You carrying that because it needs carrying? She looked confused. What? Or because you're trying to prove something? The question caught her. Clara looked down at the bucket. She slowly set it on the ground. I suppose there is a difference. Thomas nodded. There is. He picked up the bucket easily. Strength isn't pretending something is lighter than it is. Clara watched him walk away. That evening, she sat alone near the kitchen window, repairing the tear in her sleeve. The thread moved slowly through the fabric. Her mother had taught her sewing when she was young. Back then, Clara had thought it was just another lesson wealthy girls were expected to learn. Now, sitting in a small ranch house miles away from everything familiar, she understood why her mother had insisted. Useful things stayed with you, not appearances, not reputation, not the opinions of people who barely knew you. The next morning, Clara surprised everyone. She joined the ranch hands before breakfast. Walter looked at her when she arrived. You sure about this? Clara adjusted the gloves Thomas had given her. No. Walter raised an eyebrow. She continued. But I came anyway. For the first time, Walter almost smiled. Almost. The work slowly became easier. Not easy, but familiar. Clara learned the names of the horses. She learned which trails became muddy after rain. She learned how Thomas checked the fences at the western edge of the property every afternoon. And Thomas learned things about her too. He learned she kept notes about everything. Expenses, weather patterns, supplies, even small repairs that needed attention. One evening, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, with several pieces of paper spread out beside her. The oil lamp cast a warm glow over the pages. What are you doing? Clara looked up. I'm making a list. Of, she turned one page toward him, things this ranch spends money on. Thomas looked down, then back at her. You've been here less than 3 weeks. I know, and you're reviewing my expenses. Clara hesitated. For a second, she thought she had crossed a line. I apologize. I should have asked first. Thomas looked at the papers again. He expected to feel offended. Instead, he noticed the careful handwriting, the organized columns, the receipts placed neatly beside each note. He pulled out the chair across from her. What have you found? Clara blinked. You want to know? That's what I asked. She sat up straighter. For the next hour, she explained what she had noticed. A supply order that seemed higher than expected. Repeated purchases from the same merchant. Money spent fixing problems that could have been prevented. Thomas listened. Really listened. When she finished, the room was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. You did all this in your spare time? Clara looked down. Yes. Why? She paused. Because no one had ever asked her that before. Because I wanted to be useful. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up one of the receipts. Think you already are. The words were quiet, almost easy to miss. But Clara heard them. She looked away before he could see how much they affected her. The next morning, Thomas handed her a small notebook. The cover was worn brown leather. What is this? For your lists. Clara ran her fingers over the cover. You didn't have to buy this, I know. She looked up. Thomas had already turned back toward the barn. A few days earlier, Clara would have wondered why a man like him bothered with such a small gesture. Now she was beginning to understand. Thomas Reed did not make grand promises. He noticed things, and he acted. By the end of the first month at Reed Valley Ranch, the woman everyone expected to return home was still there. Her hands were rougher, her dresses were simpler, her boots carried dust from the same roads as the ranch hands, and for the first time in her life, Clara Whitfield was not trying to become someone else. She was learning who she had been all along. The change at Reed Valley Ranch did not happen overnight. There was no single morning when everything became easier. The Wyoming land demanded patience. The winters still came cold. The work still left dirt beneath Clara's fingernails. The wind still pushed against the house at night, reminding her that she was far from the warm rooms and polished floors of her father's estate. But something had changed. Clara no longer woke each morning wondering how long she would last. She woke wondering what needed to be done. By the middle of spring, she knew the rhythm of the ranch almost as well as Thomas did. She knew which horses became restless before storms. She knew the southern fence needed repairs after heavy rain. She knew the kitchen stove took longer to heat when the wind came down from the mountains. And she knew Thomas Reed always drank his coffee before speaking to anyone in the morning. That small habit made her smile sometimes. Not because it was unusual, because it reminded her that even the quietest people carried their own little routines. One Tuesday morning, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with several papers spread out before him. The ranch accounts, bills, receipts, delivery notes from merchants in the nearest town. Clara noticed the tired look on his face as she poured fresh coffee into his mug. "You were awake late." Thomas looked up. "You noticed. You always leave the lamp burning in the office when you work past midnight." A small pause followed. Thomas looked toward the window. "I didn't know anyone was paying attention." Clara set the coffee down in front of him. "Somebody should." The words were simple, but Thomas looked at her a moment longer than usual. Then he returned his attention to the papers. Clara had learned not to interrupt when Thomas was thinking. But after several minutes, she noticed something. The same merchant's name appeared repeatedly on different receipts. She leaned slightly closer. "What company is that?" Thomas followed her gaze. "Barton Supply. They deliver feed and equipment?" "Yes." Clara picked up one of the receipts carefully. "And they charge different prices for similar items." Thomas looked at the paper. "Do they?" She nodded. "Look here." She pointed to 2 dates, same amount of fencing wire, different price, same delivery distance. Thomas leaned closer. The space between them narrowed as they studied the page. Neither noticed at first. They were both too focused on the numbers. "This could be a mistake," Thomas said. "It could." Clara placed the receipt back down. "But there are several mistakes." Thomas looked at the stack. For years he had managed every part of the ranch himself. The cattle, the land, the workers, the repairs. He had always believed keeping control meant handling everything alone. But the papers in front of him told another story. There were things he had missed, not because he was careless, because there were only so many hours in a day. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. Clara looked surprised. "Do what?" "See things people overlook." She looked down at the notebook he had given her. The brown leather cover was already worn from daily use. "My father's business required records." Thomas waited. Clara hesitated. "My father required me to be useful." The way she said it made him look up. There was no anger in her voice. That almost made it worse. It sounded like something she had accepted for years. Thomas closed the ledger. "You helped him." "Yes, and he still sent you away." Clara did not answer. The silence between them said enough. Thomas looked back at the papers. "We'll check every account." Clara nodded. Together they spent the afternoon in the small ranch office. The room smelled of old wood, paper, and dust from years of records being opened and closed. Clara organized the receipts by month. Thomas reviewed supply orders. They worked quietly, but it was different from the silence they had shared when she first arrived. That silence had been 2 strangers avoiding each other. This was something else. A kind of understanding. By the end of the week, they had found several problems. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would destroy the ranch immediately, but enough small losses added together to create a serious problem over time. Too much money spent on supplies. Poor planning for cattle movement. Repairs delayed. until they became more expensive. Tom stood outside the barn that evening, looking across the pasture. The sun was setting behind the mountains. Clara stood beside him, holding the notebook. "I hope you're not upset." Thomas turned. "Why would I be? Because I found problems." He looked back toward the fields. Problems were already there. A moment passed. "You just helped me see them." Clara lowered the notebook slightly. That was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for anger, for someone to tell her she had crossed a line. Instead, Thomas had listened. The following week, Thomas made changes. He renegotiated supply orders. He adjusted cattle movement between pastures. He repaired sections of fencing before they became bigger issues. The ranch hands noticed, especially Walter Briggs. One afternoon, Walter watched Clara reviewing a delivery list near the barn. "She really knows what she's doing," he said quietly. The other ranch hand beside him shrugged. "Took you long enough to notice?" Walter gave him a look. "I noticed." "No, you finally admitted it." Walter looked away toward the pasture. He did not answer. But the next morning, when Clara struggled with a box of records near the office, Walter stepped forward. "Here." She looked at him. "I can carry it." "I know." He took the other side anyway. The small gesture meant more than an apology. It meant something had changed. That evening, Thomas found Clara sitting on the porch with her notebook open. The sky was turning orange over the valley. "You saved this ranch some money." Clara looked up. "I only organized what was already there." Thomas leaned against the porch railing. "That's what good people do." She looked away. The compliment made her uncomfortable, not because she disliked hearing it, because she was not used to believing it. Thomas noticed. He did not push. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table beside her. A small envelope. "What is this?" "A receipt." Clara opened it. Inside was the payment confirmation for the new supplies they had ordered after correcting the accounts. She looked at him. "You kept it." Thomas nodded. "You said records mattered." A faint smile appeared on her face. "I did say that. You were right." The wind moved softly through the valley. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara looked toward the ranch, the fences, the fields, the barn lights beginning to glow as evening settled. A place that had once felt like exile was slowly becoming something different. Not because the land had changed, because someone had finally allowed her to be part of it. And Thomas Reed, the man who once believed he needed no one, had begun to understand something he could not write down in any ledger. Some things were not losses. Some things were investments you never knew you needed. And Clara Whitfield was becoming the one thing his ranch had been missing all along. Summer arrived slowly in Reed Valley. The snow that had covered the mountain peaks began to disappear, leaving behind clear streams, green grass, and long afternoons filled with the sounds of cattle moving across the open land. Months had passed since Clara first stepped onto the ranch carrying a single trunk and a lifetime of disappointment. The woman who arrived afraid of being judged now walked through the ranch with steady steps. Her boots were worn, her hands were stronger, her dresses were simpler. But there was something different about the way she carried herself. She no longer looked like someone waiting to be sent away. Every morning, Clara joined Thomas before the day fully began. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. Neither seemed uncomfortable with the quiet anymore. One morning, Thomas found her near the barn repairing a torn leather strap. "You're doing that wrong." Clara looked up. A small smile appeared. "Good morning to you too." Thomas glanced at the strap. "You're pulling the thread too tight." She looked at her work, then back at him. "I thought tight was better." "It is until the leather cracks." Clara handed it toward him. "Then show me." Thomas sat beside her on the wooden step outside the barn. For several minutes they worked side by side. His hands moved slowly, showing her the right way. Her eyes followed every movement. "You make that look easy," she said. Thomas looked at the strap. "I've had years of practice." Clara smiled slightly. "I suppose that is how most things work." Thomas looked at her. "How?" People only notice the result. They rarely notice how many times someone failed before they learned. For a moment, neither spoke. Thomas understood more than she realized, because he knew what it felt like to be judged by what people saw, not by what it took to get there. That afternoon, Margaret Reed stopped by the ranch carrying a basket of fresh bread and vegetables from her garden. Margaret was Thomas's widowed neighbor, a woman who had lived near Reed Valley long enough to understand the quiet habits of the people around her. She watched Clara greet her at the door. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Reed," Margaret smiled. "You can call me Margaret." Clara nodded. "Then you must call me Clara." "I already do." That made Clara laugh softly, Margaret noticed. It was the first time she had heard that sound from her. Later, while the two women prepared dinner, Margaret watched Clara carefully slice vegetables at the kitchen table. "You know," Margaret said, "Thomas has never allowed anyone to organize his pantry." Clara looked confused. "I did not ask permission, I know." Margaret smiled. "That's probably why he allowed it." Clara shook her head. "He is not as difficult as people think." Margaret paused. "No." She looked toward the window where Thomas was repairing a fence post. "He is exactly as difficult as people think." Clara laughed again. This time she did not try to hide it. As summer continued, the ranch became busier. Cattle needed moving, fences needed repairing, supplies needed ordering before winter returned. Clara found herself working beside Thomas more often. They rode together across the property, checking the far fields. At first, Thomas always rode slightly ahead, not because he wanted distance, because he was used to being alone. Slowly, without either of them noticing, their horses began moving side by side. One evening, they returned late after checking a damaged fence near the western ridge. The sun had already fallen behind the mountains. The valley was painted in shades of orange and purple. Thomas removed his hat and looked toward the horizon. "You like this view?" Clara followed his gaze. "Yes. Why?" She thought for a moment. "Because nobody here is asking me to be something else." Thomas looked at her. The answer stayed between them. A gust of wind moved across the ridge. Clara pulled her coat tighter. Thomas noticed. Without saying anything, he removed his heavier outer coat and held it toward her. She hesitated. "You'll need it. I'm fine, Thomas." He looked at her. "You always say that." A faint smile touched his face. "So do you." For a moment, they simply stood there. Two people who had spent years pretending they needed nothing. Eventually, Clara accepted the coat. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, but he did not look away immediately. Something had changed between them. Neither of them named it. Neither wanted to move too quickly. They had both known what it felt like to be trapped by someone else's decisions. Whatever was growing between them had to be chosen, not forced, not arranged, not written on a piece of paper. One evening, a storm rolled through the valley. Rain struck the windows of the ranch house while thunder moved across the mountains. The power of the storm reminded Clara how small one person could feel against the wilderness. She sat near the fireplace with a book while Thomas checked the doors and windows. When he returned, he placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table. Clara looked at him. "You made mine?" Thomas nodded. "How do you know how I take it?" He sat down across from her. "You always add a little more milk when you're tired." She stared at him. "You noticed that?" Thomas seemed almost surprised by the question. Yes. The room became quiet, not uncomfortable, just full. Clara looked down at her cup. Back in Denver, people had noticed everything about her, her appearance, her clothes, her mistakes, but Thomas noticed small things, the things that mattered. The following morning, a problem at the ranch tested their growing trust. One of the younger ranch hands made an error in the supply order, causing several items to arrive late from town. The man expected Thomas to be angry. Instead, Thomas calmly reviewed the order. Clara stepped forward. I think I know what happened. She explained the mistake and suggested a solution. The ranch hand looked embarrassed. I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield. Clara shook her head. We fix problems. We do not spend all day punishing ourselves for making them. Thomas watched her. Those were almost the same words he had once said to her. Now she was giving them to someone else. That evening, after the others had gone, Thomas stood near the porch railing. You've changed this place. Clara looked at the fields. I think this place changed me. Thomas was quiet. Then he said, maybe both are true. The words were simple, but Clara felt them. Over the months, she had stopped thinking of Reed Valley as the place her father sent her. It had become the place where she learned to work, the place where she was respected, the place where someone looked at her without trying to measure her worth. And Thomas Reed, the man who once believed a quiet life meant a lonely one, had begun to understand that solitude and peace were not the same thing. But just as Clara finally began to believe she had found a home, something waited on the horizon. A letter, a name, a reminder of the life she thought she had left behind. And before long, the past she escaped would come riding back toward Reed Valley. The first sign was not a person, it was a letter. It arrived on a cool autumn morning when the valley had begun preparing for winter. The grass had turned golden, the mornings carried a sharper chill, and the mountains surrounding Reed Valley wore a thin layer of snow along their highest peaks. Clara was standing near the ranch gate when the mail rider arrived. The man handed her several envelopes and a small package of supplies from town. Morning, Miss Whitfield. Good morning. She thanked him and carried the mail back toward the house. Most of the letters were ranch-related, a receipt from the feed supplier, a note from Margaret about winter vegetables, an order confirmation for tools Thomas had requested. Then she saw the final envelope. The handwriting was familiar. She stopped walking. The name on the front was written clearly. Clara Whitfield. For several seconds, she simply held it. The ranch continued around her. A horse moved inside the stable. A hammer struck wood near the barn. Someone called out about a fence repair, but Clara heard none of it. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it on birthday cards that became shorter every year, on business documents, on letters where every sentence felt like an instruction. Her father, she carried the envelope inside. Thomas was at the kitchen table checking inventory numbers from the previous month. His coffee mug sat beside him, untouched. He noticed her expression before he noticed the letter. What happened? Clara placed the envelope on the table. Thomas looked down. He did not reach for it. He waited. That small gesture mattered. He had always given her the choice to speak when she was ready. Clara sat across from him. My father. The room became quiet. Thomas leaned back slightly. Do you want to open it? She looked at the envelope. A year ago, she would have torn it open immediately. Not because she wanted to hear from him, because some part of her still hoped he would finally say the words she had waited years to hear. I was wrong. I should have protected you. I am sorry. But time had changed things. She opened the letter carefully. The paper inside was expensive. The handwriting was neat, formal, cold. Clara read the first lines silently, Then her fingers tightened around the page. Thomas watched her. Not the letter. Her. What does it say? She placed the paper down. He wants me to return to Colorado. Thomas said nothing. Clara looked back at the letter. He says he has reconsidered what happened. A brief silence followed. Then Thomas asked, "Do you believe him?" Clara did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. She continued reading. Her father wrote about family, about responsibility, about mistakes, words that sounded gentle when written down. But Clara knew him. She knew what he avoided saying. Thomas noticed the change in her face. There is more. Clara looked up. Yes, she folded the letter. He wants me to marry Caleb Dawson. The name hung in the room. Thomas remembered him. The man from the agreement. The man who had looked at Clara as though she was part of a business transaction. Why? Clara looked toward the window. Because my father needs help. With what? She hesitated. Then she reached for another paper inside the envelope. A second document, not from her father, from someone else. The name at the bottom caught Thomas's attention. Samuel Hart. Who is that? Thomas asked. A lawyer. Clara unfolded the document. Samuel Hart explained the situation carefully. Edward Whitfield's cattle investments had suffered several losses. Several business deals had failed. His reputation among investors was weakening. Caleb Dawson had offered financial support, but only if the marriage arrangement was completed. Thomas read the page after Clara handed it to him. The words were formal, professional, but the meaning was clear. Her father was not asking her to come home. He was asking her to sacrifice herself. Again. Clara walked toward the window. Outside, the ranch stretched across the valley. The same fields that once felt unfamiliar now felt like a part of her. The same house where she had once entered as a stranger now held her favorite chair by the fireplace. The thought surprised her. She had a favorite chair. She had routines. She had people who knew her. 6 months ago, she said quietly, I would have gone back. Thomas looked at her. Why? Because I thought being wanted by my family mattered more than anything else. She looked down at her hands, even if they only wanted me for what I could provide. Thomas remained silent. Clara folded the letter again. I spent my whole life trying to become someone my father could be proud of. Her voice became quieter, and I never realized he was never looking for me. Thomas looked at her. The words affected him more than he showed, because he understood something about being alone, about building walls, about believing needing someone was a weakness. But Clara had taught him something different. Sometimes the hardest thing was not surviving alone. It was accepting that someone might truly want you there. That afternoon, Margaret stopped by the ranch. She noticed the tension immediately. What happened? Clara handed her the letter. Margaret read it slowly. When she finished, she folded it and placed it back on the table. Are you going? Clara looked toward the kitchen window. For a moment, she saw the old road, the road that had taken her away from Colorado, the road that had carried her toward a life she never expected. I don't know. Margaret sat beside her. Do you miss home? Clara thought about the question. She missed her mother's voice. She missed the old barn where she played as a child. She missed the person she had been before disappointment became the way her father saw her. But that was not the same as missing the life she left. I miss what I wanted home to be, Margaret nodded. That is a hard thing to admit. Clara looked at her. Why? Because sometimes we spend years mourning a place that never truly existed. The words stayed with Clara. That evening, Thomas found her sitting on the porch. The valley was quiet. The last light of day rested over the mountains. He stood nearby, not too close, giving her room. You don't have to decide tonight. Clara looked at him. My father expects an answer. Thomas nodded. Your father always has. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she looked down. What if he is right? Thomas's expression changed slightly. About what? What if I belong there? The question was quiet, not because she believed it, because a part of her still feared it. Thomas stepped onto the porch. Clara, she looked up. You came here because someone else decided your worth. A pause. You don't have to let him decide it again. The wind moved through the trees. Neither spoke for a while. Then Clara folded the letter and placed it beside her. For the first time, she did not feel like a daughter waiting for permission. She felt like a woman standing at a crossroads. One road led back to everything familiar. The other led forward, toward the life she had built, toward the ranch, toward the man who had never asked her to prove she deserved kindness. But before Clara could choose, the past would arrive in person. And this time, her father would not be sending a letter. He would be coming himself. The first sign was the sound of unfamiliar horses on the road. It was late afternoon when Clara noticed them. She was standing near the garden behind the ranch house, gathering the last vegetables before the colder weather arrived. The air smelled of dry grass and coming snow. A few yellow leaves moved across the ground with the wind. Thomas was repairing a section of fence near the eastern pasture when he saw the riders approaching. He stopped. Not because strangers were unusual. Travelers passed through the valley from time to time. But these riders did not move like ordinary visitors. They came with confidence, with the kind of confidence belonging to people who expected doors to open before they knocked. Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth and watched as the 3 horses reached the ranch gate. The first rider removed his gloves. Edward Whitfield. Even after months apart, Clara would have recognized him anywhere. The same expensive coat, the same carefully groomed appearance, the same expression that suggested he was entering a room he already owned. Behind him sat Caleb Dawson, and beside them was a hired driver carrying several leather bags. Thomas walked toward the gate. Clara saw them from the garden. For a moment, she did not move. The sight of her father standing there brought back memories she thought she had buried. The office, the papers, the crowd watching, the moment he handed her life away as if it were a business decision. Thomas glanced back and saw her. He did not call her forward. He did not decide for her. He simply waited. Clara took a breath. Then she walked toward them. Edward looked at her as she approached. His eyes moved over her clothing, the plain work dress, the boots, the gloves in her hand. For a brief second, something like surprise crossed his face, then it disappeared. So this is what you have become. Clara stopped. Not because the words hurt, because she recognized them. The same judgment, the same disappointment. Only now it sounded smaller than before. I have become myself, she answered. Edward's expression tightened. Caleb looked between them. He gave Clara a polite smile. Miss Whitfield, she nodded once. Mr. Dawson. There was no warmth in the greeting, no anger either, just distance. Thomas stepped forward. Mr. Whitfield. Edward looked at him. So you are Thomas Reed? Yes. The 2 men studied each other. Edward expected a ranch hand, perhaps someone desperate enough to accept a deal involving another man's daughter. Instead, he found someone calm, someone who did not lower his eyes. I believe there are matters we need to discuss. Thomas glanced towards Clara. The matters involving her should be discussed with her. Edward's face changed slightly. It was a small reaction, but Clara noticed. Her father was not used to being reminded that she had a voice. They entered the ranch house. The room suddenly felt smaller with Edward inside it. Thomas remained standing near the fireplace. Clara sat at the table. Edward placed his gloves beside him. I came here because I believe mistakes have been made. Clara looked at him. Mistakes? Yes, he spoke slowly, carefully. As your father, I admit I acted out of frustration. Thomas remained silent. Clara waited. She knew him too well. An apology from Edward always seemed to arrive carrying conditions. I have reconsidered the situation, Edward continued. You have had time away. You have learned responsibility. Clara looked at him. You mean I have become easier to control? Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Edward ignored the comment. The important thing is that you can return home. Clara almost smiled. Home. That word once meant everything. Now it sounded unfamiliar. And Caleb, Edward looked toward him. He has agreed to move past the difficulties between you. Caleb offered a small nod. I believe we both understand what is expected. Clara stared at him. Expected. Another familiar word. Everything with her father had always been about what was expected. Never what she wanted. Never what she felt. Thomas looked toward Clara. He did not interrupt. He let her answer. No. The room became quiet. Edward blinked. No. Clara's hands rested calmly on the table. I am not returning to Colorado. Her father leaned back. You do not understand what you are saying. I understand perfectly. You are allowing this man and this place to influence you. Thomas's expression remained still, but Clara noticed his hand tighten slightly at his side, not anger, restraint. Edward continued, You were raised for a different life. Clara looked around the room, at the wooden walls, the simple furniture, the small marks left from daily work. This is my life, Edward shook his head. You cannot honestly believe that. I do, for a moment. Nobody spoke. Then Caleb leaned forward. Clara, perhaps you are confusing gratitude with affection. The words were gentle, but the meaning was not. You are comfortable here because Thomas gave you a place when no one else wanted the responsibility. Clara looked at him, then at Thomas. A small uncertainty crossed her face. Thomas noticed, and that bothered him more than Caleb's insult, because he knew exactly where those words came from, the old wound, the one Clara had carried for years. Edward saw it too. He stepped closer. Come home, Clara, his voice softened. You have always been sensitive. You allow people to convince you of things that are not true. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment. The room became quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the windows. Thomas wanted to speak, wanted to tell her what he knew, that she was not a burden, that she had changed the ranch, that she had changed him. But he stopped, because this was not his choice. It had to be hers. That evening, after Edward and Caleb settled into a room at a nearby boarding house in town, Clara remained outside near the barn. Thomas found her there. She was standing beside one of the horses, brushing its mane. You should be resting. She did not turn. I am tired. Thomas nodded. I know. A long silence followed. Then Clara spoke. My father made me feel like I was something that needed to be corrected. Thomas looked at her. He was wrong. She looked down. What if Caleb is right? Thomas frowned slightly. About what? What if I am only here because you felt responsible for me? The question landed harder than she intended. Thomas took a breath. Clara. She looked at him. I know what it feels like to think you have to earn your place. His voice was quiet. But you do not have to earn yours here. For a moment, she held his gaze. Then she looked away. The next morning, Edward arrived at the ranch again. This time he brought papers, legal documents, and behind him stood Samuel Hart, the lawyer who had delivered the letter. The past had not come to ask, it had come to take, and Clara was about to discover just how far her father was willing to go to reclaim the daughter he had once given away. The morning air felt heavier than usual. A thin layer of frost covered the grass around Reed Valley Ranch. The mountains stood quiet in the distance, their peaks hidden behind pale clouds. Even the ranch seemed to move more slowly, as if it sensed the tension sitting over the land. Clara stood near the kitchen table as Samuel Hart placed the documents in front of her. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, not because of Clara, because he understood what the papers represented. "I want you to read these carefully," Samuel said. Edward stood behind him with his arms crossed. "I have already explained the situation." Samuel glanced briefly at him, then back at Clara. "Your father believes this agreement gives him certain rights regarding the arrangement made when you came here." Clara looked down at the papers. The words were formal, cold, written in a way that made a person sound less like a person and more like a line in a business record. She recognized the feeling. Her entire life had been reduced to decisions made by others. Thomas stood near the doorway. He did not step forward. He did not reach for the papers. He simply watched, because this was Clara's battle. Edward noticed his silence. "You see," he said, "even he understands this is not his concern." Thomas looked at him. "It concerns Clara." Edward's expression hardened. "She is my daughter." Clara lifted her eyes. "And that is why you believe you can decide everything for me." The room went quiet. Samuel lowered his gaze. He had seen many disagreements between families, but this was different. This was not about money alone. It was about a woman finally refusing to disappear. Edward walked toward the table. "You do not understand what is happening." Clara almost laughed. The old words, always the same, "You do not understand," as if her thoughts were always wrong before she even spoke. "I understand that you sent me away." Edward's face changed. "I sent you here to teach you responsibility. No." Her voice was calm. "That is what you told yourself." The statement surprised everyone, even Clara, because months ago, she would have lowered her eyes. She would have apologized for speaking too strongly. But she was not that woman anymore. Edward looked toward Thomas. "You have filled her head with ideas." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara answered for him. "No one filled my head with anything." She touched the papers. "I learned here that my opinions matter." Edward shook his head. "This ranch has convinced you that a simple life is enough." Clara looked around, at the wooden walls, at the small kitchen where she and Margaret had prepared meals, at the desk where she had organized the ranch accounts, at the window where she had watched storms roll across the valley. "This place gave me something I never had." Edward waited. Respect. The word stayed in the room. For a moment, even Caleb looked uncomfortable. Then Caleb stepped forward. "You are making this emotional." Clara looked at him. "I am talking about my life." Caleb sighed. "You always had difficulty seeing what was best for you." There it was, the same judgment, the same assumption, that because Clara did not look the way people expected, she could not know what she wanted. Tom looked away for a moment, not because he disagreed, because he knew how deeply those words could hurt. Later that afternoon, Edward and Caleb walked through the ranch. Thomas followed at a distance while Clara remained near the house with Samuel. The lawyer quietly reviewed the documents again. "There is something you should know." Clara looked up. "What?" Samuel hesitated. "Your father's financial situation is worse than he admitted." She already knew, but hearing it confirmed made something inside her sink. "How much worse?" Samuel folded the papers. "He needs the Dawson agreement completed. Without it, several investors may withdraw." Clara stared toward the fields, "So I was never the daughter he wanted back." Samuel did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was already there. That evening, Edward approached Thomas near the barn. The sun was setting behind the mountains. "I know what you are doing." Thomas looked at him. "I'm fixing a fence." Edward's expression remained serious. "You know exactly what I mean." Thomas placed the tool down. If you have something to say, say it. Edward stepped closer. You think you have saved her? Thomas did not respond. She came here damaged, Edward continued. She was angry, confused, looking for someone to blame. Thomas looked toward the house, and now? Edward followed his gaze. Now she thinks she belongs here. Thomas was quiet. Edward lowered his voice. You should know something. This ranch was already struggling before she arrived. Thomas's expression changed slightly. Edward continued. You were considering selling part of this land last winter. The words landed. Thomas had not expected that information to come from him. I was considering options because the ranch was failing. Thomas looked away. He remembered those difficult months. The unpaid bills, the repairs, the uncertainty. Edward noticed the hesitation. She thinks she helped save this place. Thomas looked back. She did. Edward shook his head. You are letting your feelings cloud your judgment. Thomas became still because Edward had said something close to the truth, not the truth Edward believed, but something close. Thomas cared about Clara more than he had expected, more than he was prepared to admit. But before he could answer, Edward walked away. That night, Clara sat alone near the fireplace. The ranch was quiet, too quiet. Thomas entered the room but stopped when he saw her expression. You heard. She nodded. My father told me. Thomas stood there. He told you the ranch was failing before I came. Clara looked at him. Was it? Thomas hesitated, only for a moment. But Clara noticed. That was enough. I see. Clara, she stood. No. Her voice was not angry. That made it worse. I need to understand something. Thomas took a step forward. You helped this ranch, but it needed help. Yes, the answer came too quickly. Clara looked away. That single word confirmed her fear. She had spent her whole life feeling like a burden, and now, even here, she wondered if she had simply become another responsibility. Thomas lowered his voice. That is not what I meant, but the damage was already done. Clara picked up her coat. Thank you for everything. Thomas frowned. Where are you going? She looked toward the door. I don't know yet. Clara. She stopped. For a moment, he almost said everything, that she mattered, that the ranch was not the only thing that changed, that he did not want a life without her in it. But years of silence held him back. And Clara saw that silence differently. She saw uncertainty. She saw hesitation. She saw the same thing she had always feared, that she was easy to leave. The next morning, before sunrise, Clara packed her trunk, the same trunk she had carried from Colorado. Only this time it felt heavier. Thomas found her near the gate. The valley was still dark. Please don't go. Clara looked at him. There was pain in her eyes, but also strength. I cannot stay somewhere if I am only needed. Thomas stepped closer. That is not true. Then what am I? He stopped, because the answer was not something he could explain with a few words. Clara nodded slowly. That is what I thought. She climbed into the wagon. Thomas stood there as the wheels moved away from the ranch. The place that had once been silent because he lived alone was now silent for a different reason. He watched until she disappeared beyond the road. And for the first time since Clara arrived, Thomas Reed understood something painful. A person could lose someone without ever saying goodbye. And sometimes the hardest part was knowing you had the chance to stop them. But you waited too long. For the first few days after Clara left, Thomas Reed kept expecting to hear her footsteps. It was foolish. He knew that. But the mind had its own habits. In the early mornings, before sunrise, he would step into the kitchen and look toward the small table near the window. The chair was empty. The second coffee mug remained untouched on the shelf. The notebook Clara had used to track ranch expenses was still sitting beside the ledger. Everything was where she had left it. And somehow, that made the ranch feel more empty than if she had taken everything with her. Thomas had spent years building Reed Valley's ranch. He had survived failed seasons, harsh winters, and long months when every dollar had to be counted carefully. He knew how to repair fences, he knew how to manage cattle, he knew how to work until his hands ached and his body demanded rest. But he did not know how to return to a life that no longer felt complete. The ranch continued. That was the strange part. The horses still needed feeding, the cattle still needed moving, the fences still needed repairs. The world did not stop because one person was gone. But Thomas noticed every place where Clara had been: the garden behind the house, the shelf where she organized supplies, the office where she had turned scattered papers into clear records, the chair beside the fireplace where she read in the evenings. Small things, things he had never thought about before, now they were everywhere. One morning, Margaret Reed arrived with a basket of bread and fresh eggs. She walked into the kitchen and immediately noticed the silence. Thomas was standing near the counter, looking at a stack of receipts. "You have been staring at those papers for 10 minutes. Thomas looked up. "I'm working." Margaret set the basket down. "No." She removed her coat. "You're avoiding." Thomas looked away. Margaret had known him too long to be fooled. "You miss her?" He did not answer. That was answer enough. Margaret poured herself coffee from the pot. "She was not asking you to save her, Thomas." He remained quiet. "She never wanted that." Thomas looked toward the window. "I tried to help." Margaret shook her head. "That is the problem." He looked at her. "What do you mean? You thought helping meant giving her a place to stay." Margaret paused. But Clara already had a place. She proved that every day she was here. Thomas looked down. "She thought she was only useful. And did you ever tell her otherwise?" The question stayed in the room. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew the answer. No, he had shown her respect. He had given her opportunities. He had trusted her judgment, but he had never said the words she needed to hear. Margaret softened slightly. "Thomas, you are a good man." He looked almost uncomfortable hearing it. "But you hide behind being a good man, because it is easier than being an honest one." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you can fix a broken fence because the fence tells you exactly what is wrong." Margaret looked toward the empty chair. "People are different." Tom said nothing. Sometimes they need you to say what you feel before they believe it. That evening, Thomas rode alone to the western edge of the ranch, the place where he and Clara had often checked the fences together. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. He stopped near the old wooden post where they had once shared a conversation about home. He remembered her standing there, the way she had looked at the land, the way she had said nobody here asked her to be something else. Thomas removed his hat. For the first time in years, he admitted something he had avoided. He was afraid, not of losing the ranch, not of failing, of losing Clara. The next morning, he made a decision. He would find her, not because she belonged to him, she never had, but because she deserved the truth. Before leaving, he walked through the house one more time. He entered the office. On the desk was Clara's notebook. He opened it. The pages were filled with careful writing, expenses, plans, ideas, notes about improving the ranch. Near the back, he found something he had never seen before. A small list, not of ranch problems, of things she had learned. How to ride farther without fear, how to recognize weather changes, how to understand the cattle, how to trust herself. Thomas ran his fingers over the page. She had been changing every day, and he had been so focused on protecting the ranch that he almost missed what mattered most. Outside, the weather began turning. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains. The first winter storm of the season was coming. The ranch hands warned him the roads would become dangerous. Walter Briggs approached while Thomas prepared his horse. "You leaving?" Thomas tightened the saddle strap. "I need to find Clara." Walter nodded slowly. Nobody questioned him, not anymore. After everything that had happened, even Walter understood. "She helped this place," Walter said. Thomas looked at him. Walter glanced toward the ranch house. "But I think she helped you more." Thomas said nothing. He did not need to. The road ahead was long, and the storm was coming fast, but he knew where he needed to go. Meanwhile, Clara had not returned to Colorado. That was the first thing Thomas discovered when he reached the nearest town. The boarding house clerk shook his head. "No Clara Whitfield here." Thomas frowned. She was traveling alone. The clerk thought for a moment. Wait. He checked a small notebook behind the counter. There was a woman matching that description. She'd passed through 2 days ago. Where did she go? The clerk pointed toward the northern road, an old settlement near the mountain pass. Thomas looked outside. Snow clouds were already moving across the sky. That road was difficult even in good weather. He thanked the man and stepped back into the cold. Clara had not gone home. She had not gone back to the life she escaped. She had gone somewhere else, somewhere she could be alone, somewhere she could decide who she was without anyone telling her. Thomas mounted his horse. The first snowflakes began to fall, and far beyond the valley, in a small settlement surrounded by mountains, Clara Whitfield was about to face the same truth Thomas had finally understood. Leaving Reed Valley had not meant she stopped loving it. She had left because she was afraid she was never truly chosen. And before the winter storm ended, both of them would have to decide whether love was something they could finally say out loud, or something they would lose because they were too afraid. The mountain road became nearly impossible by the time Thomas reached the northern settlement. Snow covered the ground in thick layers. The wind moved between the trees with enough force to shake the branches above him. The path that had been visible in the morning was slowly disappearing beneath the storm. But Thomas kept going. He had spent most of his life accepting difficult things, long days, hard choices, lonely nights. This felt different, because for once, the thing he was fighting for was not land, not money, not the ranch. It was a person who had changed the way he looked at his own life. By late afternoon, Thomas reached the small settlement near the mountain pass. There were only a few buildings, a general store, a small clinic, a boarding house with smoke rising from its chimney. He found Clara's name in the visitor records at the clinic. The older woman behind the counter looked at him carefully. "You know her?" Thomas removed his gloves. "Yes." The woman studied his face. "She came here 3 days ago. Is she all right?" "She is." The answer should have relieved him. Instead, he noticed the woman's expression. "But," the woman sighed, "but she has been helping everyone else instead of taking care of herself." Thomas almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Clara. What happened? A family came through before the storm. Their youngest child was sick. Clara stayed to help. Thomas looked toward the window. Snow continued falling. "She's still here?" The woman nodded. "Near the old Miller cabin. She thought the storm would pass before morning." Thomas looked outside again. It had gotten worse, much worse. The woman shook her head. "You won't make it there tonight." Thomas picked up his gloves. "I have to try." The woman studied him. Then she quietly handed him a lantern. "Take this." He accepted it. "Thank you. Bring her back safely." Thomas nodded, but as he stepped outside, he knew something. Clara had never needed him to rescue her. That was never who she was. She needed someone who would stand beside her. And that was what he intended to do. Meanwhile, several miles away, Clara sat beside a small fire inside the abandoned cabin. The storm had trapped her there. The old wooden walls creaked with every strong gust of wind. Snow gathered along the windows, turning the outside world into a blur of white. She had spent the last 2 days helping a family traveling through the area, a mother with 2 children, a father too exhausted to continue. Clara had used the small medical kit she carried to help them recover from the cold. It was not much, but it was something. That was what she had learned at Reed Valley. Small things mattered. A warm meal, a repaired fence, a hand offered at the right moment. She sat near the fire and looked at her reflection in the dark window. For months, she had believed she was building a new life. Then one conversation had brought everything back. The fear, the doubt, the feeling that she was only valuable when she was useful. She thought about Thomas, the way he had looked at her when she first arrived. Not with pity, not with judgment, with patience. She thought about the notebook he gave her, the coat he placed around her shoulders, the way he always waited for her answer instead of making decisions for her. A tear formed in her eye, not because she regretted leaving, because she finally understood why leaving hurt so much. She had not been running away from Thomas. She had been running away from the fear that one day he would see her the way everyone else had, as a burden, a responsibility, someone temporary. Outside, the wind grew louder. Then came the sound of movement. Clara stood immediately. Someone was outside. A few seconds later, the cabin door opened. Thomas stepped inside. Snow covered his coat. His face was tired from the journey, but his eyes found hers immediately. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, everything became still. Thomas. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He closed the door behind him. "I found you," she looked at him. "You came through that storm?" He nodded. Clara shook her head. "You could have been hurt." Thomas removed his gloves. "I know." That answer surprised her. He was not pretending he had no fear. He was not pretending everything was simple. He was just there. With her, the same way she had needed. Not to be saved. To not be alone. They spent the night inside the cabin. The fire burned low as they talked. Not about the ranch, not about her father, about everything they had avoided saying. Finally, Clara looked down at her hands. "I left because I thought I was becoming another responsibility." Thomas was quiet. "I know." She looked up. "You knew?" "I know because I made you feel that way." Her expression changed. Thomas stared into the fire. "I thought if I gave you the place here, gave you work, gave you respect, that would be enough." He paused. "But I never told you what you meant to me." Clara did not speak because she was afraid to hope. Thomas continued. "You were never a debt." His voice was steady. "You were never a problem to solve." The fire cracked softly. "You became the person I looked for every morning." Clara looked away quickly. Thomas continued. "When something happened at the ranch, you were the first person I wanted to tell." A long silence followed. Then Clara whispered, "Why didn't you say anything?" Thomas looked at her because the answer was the truth. "I spent years believing needing someone made me weak." He lowered his eyes. "I forgot that trusting someone could also make you stronger." The storm continued through the night, but inside the small cabin, something that had been frozen for months finally began to thaw. The next morning, the storm weakened. The sky cleared. Snow covered the valley like a blanket. Clara and Thomas walked back toward the settlement together. Not ahead, not behind, side by side. When they reached the road, Clara stopped. "Thomas," he turned. "I need to know something." "What?" "If I come back, I need to know I am not returning because the ranch needs me." Thomas looked at her. Clara, she waited. You're coming back because I need you. She looked down. He continued. But not because you fix things. A pause. Because you are you. For the first time in days, Clara smiled. A real smile, the kind Thomas had not seen since before her father arrived. They continued walking, but neither of them knew the storm they had survived was only the beginning, because when they returned to Reed Valley, Edward Whitfield would still be waiting. And this time, he would not be asking Clara to come home. He would be demanding that she prove she had the right to choose her own. The return to Reed Valley felt different. The same mountains stood above the valley, the same fences stretched across the land, the same wooden sign hung above the ranch gate, but Clara was not the same woman who had left. When she and Thomas arrived, Margaret was waiting near the house. The older woman said nothing at first. She simply walked forward and wrapped Clara in a quiet embrace. Clara held on for a moment longer than she expected. I was worried about you, Margaret whispered. I know. Thomas stood a few steps away, giving them space. He looked toward the ranch. The place that had once felt empty now felt alive again, not because anything had changed, because the person who belonged there had returned. But the peace did not last long. 2 days later, Edward Whitfield returned. This time he did not come with a smile. He arrived with documents, a lawyer's confidence, and the belief that the matter had already been decided. The town had heard about the disagreement. People gathered outside the small courthouse near the main street. Not because they wanted trouble, because everyone knew the Whitfield name, and everyone knew Clara's story. Samuel Hart arrived early that morning carrying a leather briefcase. He met Clara near the courthouse steps. You are certain? Clara looked through the open doors. Inside waited her father, Caleb Dawson, several townspeople, and the documents that had controlled her life for months. Yes, she said. Samuel nodded. Then today is not about proving you belong somewhere. Clara looked at him. It is about proving I belong to myself. The lawyer smiled slightly. That will be enough. Inside the courthouse, Edward stood when Clara entered. For a moment, he looked almost relieved, as if he believed she had finally returned to the role he expected. Clara. She stopped. There was a time when hearing her name spoken by him would have made her search his voice for approval. Not anymore. Father. Edward looked toward Thomas, then back at her. I hope you understand how unnecessary this has become. Clara remained silent. Edward placed a hand on the papers in front of him. You were confused, influenced by circumstances. Stepped forward. Mr. Whitfield, the matter before us is not whether you approve of your daughter's choices. Edward frowned. I am her father, Samuel nodded, and she is an adult woman. The room became quiet. Edward looked around. He was used to being respected. Used to people agreeing before he finished speaking, but today, nobody moved. Nobody rushed to support him. The judge asked Samuel to present the documents. The first papers were the original agreement, the same agreement Edward had created months earlier, the agreement that sent Clara to Reed Valley. Edward watched calmly until Samuel reached the next page. This document states that Miss Whitfield was transferred to Reed Valley Ranch as part of a settlement arrangement connected to your business obligations. Edward's expression changed slightly. That was not the intention. Samuel looked at him. Intentions are not written here, sir. He lifted another page. Only terms. Clara looked down. She had seen the papers before, but she had never understood the full meaning, not until now. Samuel continued, the agreement makes no mention of temporary employment. He paused. No mention of punishment. Another pause. It records a permanent transfer of responsibility. A murmur moved through the room. Edward's face tightened. That is a ridiculous interpretation. Samuel calmly opened another file. Then perhaps you can explain why the same document was later used to secure financial negotiations with Caleb Dawson. The room became still. Caleb shifted in his chair. Edward looked toward him. Just for a second. But Clara saw it, the look between them, the truth. Samuel placed another paper on the table. Mr. Dawson's investment agreement depended on Miss Whitfield's marriage. Clara looked at her father. So that was always the plan. Edward looked away. Clara, you are misunderstanding. No. Her voice was quiet. But everyone heard it. For once, I understand perfectly. Edward's expression softened. Different tactic. Everything I did was to protect you. Clara looked at him. The old Clara might have believed those words. The woman standing there now did not. Protect me from what? Edward hesitated. From hardship. She glanced around the room. At Samuel, at Thomas, at the people who had seen her build a life. I found hardship. Her voice grew stronger, but I also found respect. Edward shook his head. You cannot compare this place to the life you were born into. Clara looked toward Thomas, then back at her father. I am not comparing places. She paused. I am comparing how I was treated. The words settled over the room. Thomas stood quietly near the back. He wanted to step beside her, but he knew this moment belonged to her. She had spent her entire life being spoken for. Now she was speaking. Samuel presented the final evidence. The original agreement carried Edward's own signature, the same signature that proved he had willingly sent Clara away, the same signature that proved he had no right to claim she had been taken against her will. The document created to control her had become the proof that she had been denied a choice. Edward stared at the page. For the first time, he had nothing prepared to say. The hearing continued. Questions were asked, answers were given. By the end, the truth was clear. Clara was not a possession, not a debt, not a business arrangement. She was a woman who had chosen her own life. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Edward stepped onto the street. He looked older than he had when he arrived. For a moment, Clara thought he might apologize. She waited, but pride held him back. I hope you know what you are giving up, he said. Clara looked at him. I already know what I gave up, she paused. A life where I was never allowed to be enough. Edward said nothing. Then he walked away. Later that evening, Clara stood outside the ranch house with Thomas. The valley was quiet, peaceful. You did it, Thomas said. Clara shook her head. No, she looked toward the mountains. I chose. Thomas nodded, because he understood the difference. For years, Clara had been fighting against people who wanted to decide her future. Today, she had finally taken it back. Thomas reached for her hand, slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She did not, and as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Clara Whitfield finally stood in a place no one could take from her. Not because someone gave it to her, because she had chosen it herself. Years later, people across Wyoming territory knew the name Reed Valley Ranch, not because it was the largest ranch, not because it belonged to the wealthiest family, but because of the way it treated people. Travelers passing through the mountains often stopped there for supplies or directions. Families looking for work found a place where they were welcomed. Ranch hands who had nowhere else to go found steady wages and a fair employer. And at the center of it all stood Clara Whitfield Reed, the same woman who had once arrived at the ranch carrying a small trunk and a heart full of doubt. The same woman her father believed would never survive outside the life he chose for her. Now, she walked through this ranch yard every morning with a notebook in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Her boots were worn from years of work. Her coat carried traces of dust from the fields. Her hair was often tied back simply, without the careful arrangements she once wore in Denver. She no longer dressed to prove anything. She dressed for the life she lived. The ranch had grown over the years. New barns had been built. More cattle moved through the valley. The old office where Clara first organized Thomas's records had been expanded into a larger room with shelves filled with ledgers and maps. But some things remained the same: the wooden porch, the mountain view, the small kitchen table where two people had first learned how to trust each other. Thomas Reed stood outside the barn one morning, checking a delivery list. His hair had begun to show silver. His movements were slower than when Clara first arrived, but the quiet strength that had always been part of him remained. Clara walked toward him. "You forgot breakfast." Thomas looked up. "I was going to eat later." She handed him a wrapped piece of bread. "You always say that." A small smile appeared on his face. "And you always notice." Clara smiled back. It was a simple exchange, the kind that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But for them, it carried years of memories, years of choosing each other, not once, every day. Later that afternoon, Margaret visited the ranch. Age had softened her face, but not her sharp sense of humor. She sat on the porch while Clara poured tea. "You know," Margaret said, looking across the valley, "your father would hardly recognize this place." Clara followed her gaze: the fields, the workers, the families living nearby, the children running between the buildings. "I think that is because he never really saw this place." Margaret looked at her. "What do you mean?" Clara smiled faintly. "He only saw what he expected to see." She looked down at her hands. "He did the same thing with me." For years, Clara had carried the memory of her father like a heavy stone, but time had changed that. She no longer needed his approval to understand her worth. She no longer needed him to admit he was wrong. That was something she had learned from Thomas. Peace did not always come from receiving an apology. Sometimes it came from no longer needing one. As the years passed, Edward Whitfield's name became less important. The businesses he once controlled changed hands. The influence he valued faded. People remembered the choices he made, but they also remembered Clara's, the woman who was sent away as a punishment, the woman who built a life instead. One autumn evening, Clara and Thomas rode together to the ridge above the valley, the same place where they had once sat beneath the stars and talked about who they really were. The years had changed the view below. The ranch was larger now. More lights shone from the buildings. More voices filled the valley, but the mountains remained exactly the same. Thomas removed his hat and looked out over the land. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara turned toward him. "Regret what?" "Leaving your old life behind." The wind moved gently through the grass. For a moment, Clara thought about the girl she had been. The young woman standing in her father's office. The daughter who wanted so badly to be accepted. The person who believed being different meant being less. She thought about the road to Wyoming, the first night at Reed Valley, the first time Thomas handed her gloves instead of pity, the first time someone looked at her and saw more than what others criticized. She smiled. "No." Thomas looked at her. "Not even once?" Clara shook her head. "Not once." She looked down at the valley. "My father thought he was taking me away from everything I knew." She paused. "But he was actually sending me somewhere I could finally know myself." Thomas nodded slowly. After a moment, he reached for her hand. His fingers were rough from years of work. Hers were too. Their hands looked different from the ones they had when they first met. Stronger, marked by the life they built together. "You know," Thomas said, "when you first arrived, I had no idea what to do." Clara smiled. "I noticed. I thought I was giving you a place to stay." He looked toward the valley. "But you gave me something too." "What?" Thomas looked back at her. "A reason to stop living like I was alone." Clara held his gaze, and after all those years, she still recognized the quiet honesty in his voice, the same honesty that had been there from the beginning. No promises made for appearances. No words spoken because they were expected. Only truth. Below them, the lights of Reed Valley flickered against the coming night. A place that had once been a destination of punishment had become a place of belonging. A woman once told she was too much had built a life where she was enough. A cowboy who believed he needed no one had discovered that love did not make him weaker, it gave him something worth protecting. And Clara Whitfield finally understood the greatest lesson of her life. The people who reject you may leave wounds behind. They may make you question your value. They may convince you that you must earn love before you deserve it. But the right people do something different. They do not create your worth. They simply see what was there all along. As the stars appeared above Reed Valley, Clara rested her head against Thomas's shoulder. The ranch below continued its quiet rhythm. The horses, the workers, the families, the home she was never given, the home she finally found. Imagine standing where Clara once stood, carrying the weight of a lifetime of being told you were not enough, wondering if the place you were sent away to might become the place where you finally discover who you truly are. Her story was never about a ranch, a name, or a perfect life. It was about the quiet courage to keep going when the people who should have protected her were the ones who made her feel small. It was about finding someone who did not try to change her, but simply saw the worth that had always been there. Sometimes, the greatest gift is not being rescued from hardship. Sometimes it is finding the strength, the love, and the people who remind us we were never as broken as we believed. If you had been in Clara's place, would you have chosen the unknown road or returned to the life you once knew? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your story. And if stories of love, healing, mystery, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing. Many more unforgettable journeys are waiting for you in the stories still to come.